Hi everyone, my name is Filipe Serrano. I'm a Portuguese PhD candidate from Universidade de São Paulo, Brazil, and today I'll be showing you a bit of the work we've been doing with Valentina Marconi, Stephanie Dynett and Luis McRae on the untapped potential of non-English language studies in the detection of species population trends, a case study for Brazilian vertebrates. We've all seen pictures like this with animals being in their natural habitats that are being devastated. And so we hear and we see that biodiversity is declining and that overall the abundance of population is decreasing. However, how can we actually know? For us to know, we need to quantify this trend. We need to have important quantitative information in order to better design conservation efforts. And so one of the major proponents of methodology to do this is the Living Planet Index, which is an initiative in partnership with the WWF and the ZSL, and it aims to measure the state of the world's biodiversity based on population trends of vertebrate species. So it measures the average change in population size for vertebrates all around the world. It uses a standardized methodology in which it monitors data from journals, species assessments, and websites all over the world, and it includes data from populations sampled over 2 years or more in the same location with the same methodology, so that it can always be comparable between sites and populations and species. This is from the latest Living Planet report in 2022, and it includes data from over 30,000 populations of over 5,000 species, and it shows us that overall populations are declining about 69% in their population sizes. But this has a spatial component, this decline. We can see that in the global north, this decline is more or less 20%, so North America, Europe and Central Asia, whereas in the global south, Asia, Africa and Latin America, it ranges from 55% in Asia and the Pacific to 94% in Latin America and the Caribbean. Not only does this decline as a spatial component, but also biodiversity. So we have a much higher vertebrate richness in the global south, and the number of impacted species, so threats as well, are much higher in the global south, here in South America, Africa, and especially in Asia. So even though we have more species and more impacted species in the global south, the data availability is still majorly biased towards the global north. So we have much more information here in Europe and North America compared to most countries in the global south. And the LPI, the Living Planet Index, is no exception. You can see that most populations come from Europe and North America, with a much lower number of populations from the global south. And why is that? One of the main reasons could be language. So we know that English is science's lingua franca, especially since World War II. But despite this, over 36% of all publications on wildlife conservation are in languages other than English. And we know that English is less commonly spoken in the global south. So here, highlighted in purple, are countries that speak English, and you can see that in the global south there's not a lot of them that do have English as their primary language. So perhaps we're losing data where it is needed the most. So where we have the much more biodiversity and impacted species, we also have less data, and that may be due to a difference on the language in which articles are published. And so we need to quantify what is the impact of language in estimating trends of population all over the world. And so we use Brazil as a case study. It has over 200 million Portuguese-speaking people, and it is a mega diverse country. You can see here that it's very rich for birds, for mammals, and for amphibians. It has an interesting publishing landscape with several regional and national journals with high impact factors as well. And recently there has been some incentive for researchers to do baseline science and longer field trips and population studies. So Furthermore, we can see that the number of populations is increasing. The red line here represents 25,000 studies. This is throughout time. So even though English has a much higher number of publications overall, the Portuguese articles are still being increasingly published over time. So our goals were to compare the trends of abundance for Brazilian vertebrates, comparing basically a Brazilian journal dataset with international journal dataset, and also to look at the taxonomical, spatial, and temporal biases in these patterns in order to quantify the bias of the language in which the articles are published in, and also its impact on the conservation efforts. We screened 34 Brazilian journals and 78 international journals. Please keep in mind that throughout the presentation, Brazilian data will always be represented in green, whereas international data will always be represented in yellow. And so for Brazilian journals, we only looked at Portuguese articles, so articles that were written in Portuguese, and for international journals, articles that were only written in English. And so we gathered data for Brazilian populations from these two datasets, and we calculated the Living Planet Index separately for each. Keep in mind that we also excluded taxon-specific journals, since they could have biases that we would need to correct for, and we only looked at time period from 1990 to 2015. And so what we found is that despite international journals having a much higher number of articles overall, so more than 500,000 articles compared to over 16,000 articles for Brazilian journals, Brazilian journals still had more articles that had potentially relevant information. So 73 compared to international journals, which only had 30 articles with relevant information. And this discrepancy was even more evident once we looked at the number of species. So we had 324 species compared to 56 species from the international journal dataset, and even more for the number of populations, where we can see that Brazilian journals had more than four times the number of populations than international journals. And once we look at how these species are being added to the pool, we can see here that on this species accumulation curve, that the Brazilian journals curve is much steeper. So with the same number of articles, we're adding more species. And overall, we had much higher number of articles, but the international journal curve is sort of stabilizing, it's reaching a plateau. So we're adding more articles, but we're not adding as many species per article than we do with Brazilian journals. And so we can conclude that Brazilian journals have more species, they have information on more populations, they add more species per article, so there's this huge potential of relevant data to be included on assessments. Not only that, but once we look at species themselves, we can see a difference. So here on the y-axis, we can see the percentage of species in Brazil for each taxonomic group, here in the x-axis. And on top of this bar plot, you can see the absolute total number of species in Brazil. And so overall, we can see that there's a pattern of having greater representativeness. So a high percentage of species in articles that belong to Brazil. For most groups, the only exception being reptiles, of which international journals had more data than Brazilian journals. And this difference is especially evident for birds. There's this huge discrepancy in the percentage of species in Brazil represented in Brazilian journals compared to almost negligible information for international journals. And once we pull all this together, so the total number of vertebrates in Brazil, which is 405 species, we have nearly 5 times the percentage of species in the country represented, 5 times more species represented in Brazilian journals than we do on international journals. And not only that, but we know that the difference in number of species is different. With the numbers themselves are different, but only 20 species are common between the two data sets, which is surprising. And of those 20, 19 of them were fish, especially commercially used fish, such as the yellowfin tuna. So all in all, there's this great complementarity of Brazilian journal data that can be included and can be added to the international data without losing information, especially adding much more relevant information. Looking at the spatial distribution of these records, we can see that there's a similar pattern of distribution for Brazilian journals and international journals. So, but at the same time, international journals do have less data in the northeastern region of Brazil, and also there is a cluster of records here in the southeastern portion of the country, which may be due to it being closer to major cities such as São Paulo or Rio de Janeiro, which thus is cheaper and easier to do research in. And also, we can see that despite being the most biodiverse region, the Amazon is still poorly sampled, and that's common between the two data sets. Finally, looking at the trends themselves, we had data from Brazilian journals from 1977 to 2014, whereas for international journals we only had data from 1990 to 2014. And despite both having negative trends, as you can see here, so it's below 1, so it implies a decline in population size. There's a steeper trend for Brazilian journals, so it's much lower, so there's a more evident decline for Brazilian populations if the articles come from Brazilian journals. And also recently, the number itself, it's lower than the number for the international data coming from international journals. Not only that, but there's been a slight increase on the LPI if we only look at international journal data. And also we have much larger confidence intervals, almost always overlapping 1. So we have a higher uncertainty if we only look at international journal data. So finally, we saw that Brazilian journals are rich in population data, so they have a lot of species and a lot of populations. International journals are nearly 5 times less representative of vertebrates in Brazil, and Brazilian journals offer a great deal of complementarity, so we are adding not only more species, but species that were not present in international journals themselves. And all in all, data from Brazilian journals has different values and a different trend of decline, so that may be a reason to include non-English language articles for conservation efforts. So we need to look at this huge source of information that is not published in English, so looking at other languages. Our next steps might be looking at in-country differences, so looking at Portuguese and English articles published in Brazilian journals. So we can conclude, like Ludwig Wittgenstein said, a famous language philosopher, that if we spoke a different language, we would perceive a somewhat different world, and that rings true for population trends as well. Finally, I thank you, obrigado. I thank the British Ecological Society for giving us a small research grant that allowed us to do this work. The WWF, our colleagues Paula and Elga, and also my colleagues at Universidade de São Paulo here in Brazil, Márcio, Eletra, João, Juan, and Ricardo. I'll leave here my email and Twitter if you have any questions or suggestions. I'm more than happy to hear from you. And also, I'm looking at postdoc opportunities on biogeography, microecology, and conservation. So please feel free to send me an email, and thank you for your interest. And hopefully, this will be just the first step in a much larger project to include all languages across the world. Thank you.